This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. Welcome. I'm here with Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and Kathy Denici, and we're discussing a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a book club for lovers of the Word made flesh. It's Wednesday, September 6th, 2023. And today we're going to be joined, usually we have Stephanie Meter here, but this month we have Kathy Denici. Thanks for coming, Kathy. Jennifer, are you going to tell us about this month's shows? And then we'll let Kathy introduce herself.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been discussing last month the classics of British literature, and this month we're going to transition over to talk about free market economics. And so these are all texts that are in the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today we're going to talk about Edward Ellis's little article, Not Yours to Give, from a biography of Davy Crockett. And then later this month, we're going to look at The Money Mystery, Whatever Happened to Penny Candy, and The Blue Stocking Guide to Economics.
Great. And you can access those upcoming shows as well as our past episodes on my YouTube station. It's at Lee Borden's. And you can go to leebordens.com to see the calendar and what books you need to order in order to read ahead if you want to, or read along with us, whatever you want to do our shows. And I want to, besides pointing out my YouTube channel, as well as you can see how old I am. I said station. I still don't say channel. But I also point out that we have something new that I'd like you to look at, listeners. It's called educationalindependence.net. And we'll be talking more about it later in this episode. But basically, this team here and some other folks around the country have put together a declaration declaring why we believe education should be independent from government intervention. And that's just a really good segue into the book that we're reading today.
It is. And before we dive down into our essay that we're talking about today, Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience since you're new to this show?
Sure, I'd love to. My name's Kathy Denici. I've been a challenge director for many years, and I work on the curriculum development team.
Thanks for joining us. All right. So Lee, I'm going to ask you the same question I always ask you. Why is this story Not Yours to Give in the Classical Conversations curriculum?
Well, so maybe Jennifer or you, Tim, can help me out because it's actually not one of the titles of anything we read. And I do not believe it's in the Penny Candy or the Money Mystery book. So is it actually currently in one of the books that we read in Challenge 1?
Do you know, Tim?
It is in the economics reader that we've provided to many of our international friends to be reading. So our domestic audience might not be as familiar with it, but many of our international friends and communities are familiar with it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point that out because actually this article was in, it's really an article, it's only about 20 pages long, was in the Classical Conversations Challenge 1 curriculum for a very long time. And it's going to be coming back. And so, because it's a brief article that really sums up a lot of the things that relate to the integration of our literature, our debates, our economics reading, the way that we as Christians look at freedom and being free indeed. There's so many intersections in the curriculum that I'm hoping people will read Davy Crockett. It's not by Davy Crockett. We'll learn more. It's by somebody else. But this discussion Davy Crockett has, who's very famous, about freedom, and it's very approachable for parents to listen to with their children. It takes about 21 minutes. And so if you go and just type in Not Yours to Give, the last name Ellis, you'll come up with a bunch of PDFs that are available to everybody, as well as even some audios that'll play it for you. So the reason it's in the curriculum is because it ties everything together, and I look forward to bringing it back. And I'm really glad the international students are still reading it right now.
Yeah, it is a really good one of those stories, and I think we'll get into this, but it is one of those stories that kind of throws you out of the common way that we've just been doing things and says, whoa, let's put the brakes on and think about whether or not we should be doing those things. So I like
Let
it
me
for that
say
reason.
that there's a question that it inculcates, and it's this. And so as people read it and we discuss, if we can keep this in the back of our minds, it asks, is support for individuals and families in a distress situation best channeled through government or given personally by individuals from their own money? And that's the question Davy Crockett explores.
Yeah. I love that. And I'll tell a quick story about years ago when I was discussing some ideas with my Challenge 3 class. One of my students said the sentence, welfare is stupid. And I said, well, I'm going to remind you that stupid is a banned word in here because we don't know what you mean when you say that. So I need you to say what you actually meant. And she explained a little bit. I think it was kind of one of those parroting some things that had been heard at home. And so I just said, well, that's fine. So who should take care of people in need? And then we had a great conversation about, and it caused us all to think about our accepted notions of who should do that and who maybe should really be doing that. So
And I remember back in I believe it was in the 50s, Time magazine on the cover asked, what's wrong with this world? And a very well-known author answered in what used to be a letter to the editor, a very brief comment. He said, you asked what's wrong with this world. And he said, I am. And it was G.K. Chesterton, nodding to the responsibility that he has to make things right and not other people.
Yeah, I love that. All right. So we mentioned that this is a story that tells about Davy Crockett, but it's not written by him. It's actually an essay by a gentleman called Edward Ellis. And so this is probably not a household name for all of us. So I thought maybe we'd start, Kathy, if you could tell us a little bit about Mr. Ellis, who he is.
Yeah, I had not heard of him before either, and I wish I had. He was an American author who wrote in the late 1800s, and I found that he wrote over 300 novels and adventure short stories. He wrote, one of his first novels was Seth Jones, or Captives of the Frontier, which I want to go read that now. And he was awarded a publishing contract for 4 novels a year. But I also found it interesting that he was also a school teacher, and he decided to keep his teaching job, even though he had this contract, because he considered a job in hand worth 2 in the air. And then eventually he retired from teaching and was just devoted to writing.
Wow. So he's in good company. We talked in the past few weeks about G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. It sounds like he has as many works as they have. So that's great. So I know that he wrote some biographies of great Americans like Daniel Boone and some other frontiersmen. So why do you think these were a popular thing? How did he get this contract, and why did people want to read these? What do you guys think?
Well, I have to admit, this is the only one of his books that I've read. And now that Kathy reminded me there's so many, I'm gonna go read some more. But it's so folksy and it's easy going, and it takes he takes a difficult idea, makes it very clear to all age levels.
I think there's also something that's pretty common that a generation or two after someone has passed on, great people of that generation become the subject of interest in a prior generation. So now we're at that place in our society where we're looking back at the 60s and 70s and the civil rights movement, and there's a lot of interest in writing biographies of leaders from that era. So I think there's something just it's too soon when it's just one generation ago. And so maybe the 2-generation gap gives that space for people to sort of sort out who was and who wasn't so important in the end.
I think too, he makes them into stories, and I think stories make history more memorable.
Yeah, I agree. And this used to be, a mission that was pretty well understood. So if I look back to when my parents were in school, for example, in the 50s, their libraries were stocked with landmark history books, and those were the stories of landmark famous Americans. And so you guys on the call know that I collect children's books, vintage children's books, and that's one series that I collect are those landmark books, because they do such a great job of inspiring a new generation to be like these great leaders of our country. And I I love being part of the effort to preserve them. So I might need to go now and add Ellis to my list of collections.
Yeah, that's
Well,
one thing I love about book clubs is like, I mean, every single week, one of us brings up another book. I may not know that book, or I may not know that author, and it gives us a chance to just expand our resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And my dad is actually enjoying rereading them as I collect them. So it's been a nice benefit, and the font is nice and large, which helps him. So that's been fun for him to go back and revisit. He's actually reading about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington Carver right now. So anyway, so I think we've been talking about this idea that that stories are a big part of teaching history. We get inspired by the story of individuals, and Kathy already mentioned those stories of early American captives. That's a whole genre in and of itself, these stories of people who were captured on the frontier. But why in the world, Tim, would we use stories as part of our study of economics? That doesn't feel as intuitive to me.
Yeah, we use, like you just pointed out, we use stories a lot to teach a lot of different things. We put biographies in front of our children, especially of people who we want them to emulate. So Christian missionaries or great leaders or scientists and explorers, all kinds of folks whose behaviors we want them to learn from. So, stories are super powerful. Christ taught parables. I don't pretend to know the mind of Christ in this, exactly why he did that in every occasion, but certainly some of the most memorable lessons that he taught were in the form of story. He took big and important ideas and put them into story form. We do it with our kids a lot with cautionary tales. We tell them fables and myths that have reasons why not to do things or why not to be a certain way. We see stories about other children who are bullies getting their comeuppance, or Little Red Riding Hood who doesn't obey her parents and gets into trouble because of it. Because we want our children to learn those lessons from observing someone else falling into a dangerous situation by their bad behavior. And so I think with economics, we can do some of the same thing. And often it's those stories that are the things that stick with us, right? Our economics lessons that are sort of learned by rote, these sort of principles of economics, some of them stay with us, but many of the things that I remember best are the things that were embodied in someone's experience that I can learn from.
Yeah, that's good. I was thinking that one story that was a pivotal part of my grandfather's education, the way he would tell it. So he was born in 1914, and he has fond memories of learning the story of the Little Red Hen. And he was a farm kid, and this made a lot of sense to him because he had heard his father say, if you want to eat, you need to work. And then he encountered this story of Little Red Hen planting her wheat. So that's a great example of an economics story that sticks with you, and was then later adapted by Ronald Reagan in his radio addresses to make it even more poignant economic point. So I love that idea. And we've made an effort in CC to do that in science with our Uncle Paul science stories and our Roman stories. So we have lots of opportunities to learn that way.
Yeah, I have a question for Tim, since he had to answer the one about anecdotes and stories. So there's some controversy around this article because it's told as though it's a true story. And if you do the research in the congressional records, people who want to discredit the story can't find it exactly. There is a similar story that's in the congressional record, but it's not like it's an autobiography by Davy Crockett. It's a story told by a storyteller, Mr. Ellis. And so people will get mad because they act like it's it's not a true story. And so why do you think this applies to real life? How do you address that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lee, and a really big one. It's only the modern Western person who's so fixated on whether a story is factually accurate historically I think throughout human history, we've been far more concerned with whether a story is a true story with kind of a capital T implied, right? A story that tells a truth, not necessarily the story that is the most precise in all of its historical detail. The story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree has been pretty well debunked by historians. But nonetheless, I think it's a really tenacious story, and it's kind of an important one for us as Americans because it holds forth the ideal that we want to be a truth telling sort of person, right? That we as Americans care more about being honest about what happened than about covering for ourselves. And I think this sort of story is maybe falls into that camp where it's a story that tells a truth about who we want to be or who we wish we would be as a people, rather than necessarily telling us about what happened one day in the life of Davy Crockett.
Because I see this playing out in something relatively new to me. Kathy, I don't know if you've noticed this, but very often now when I watch a movie made in the last few years that's based on a true story, which is kind of what they used to say, now they're saying things like, some of this is true, and they're done. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I think we understand that all the movies we see are based on something. None of it's factually completely true, but if it embodies a character or tells a story with a point to the story, then that's the truth in it, even if the details aren't the truth.
So
Yeah,
Jennifer, this probably sounds funny coming from some Christians. I just wanted to hear your opinion on this.
Well, so I can think of another example that might help us. There's that often told story of how Abraham Lincoln told Harriet Beecher Stowe when he met her that she's the little lady who started the Civil War. And now there's all these people who are saying, oh, he never said that to her. And essentially, I think what I would answer is I'm not sure it matters, because it is still true that abolition societies published all kinds of newspapers and went around giving speeches. But the thing that seemed to ignite the public imagination was her novel about a fictional slave who was being mistreated. So whether or not Lincoln said it is almost immaterial to me. It is telling that truth that we have already landed on in this discussion, that stories are powerful. They can move the hearts of people in a way that maybe a dry factual speech did not. And so whether or not Lincoln said that to her, I think we can say it is true that her story started the war. It is what ignited the abolition movement and gave it a kickstart.
And there's other stories that are similarly powerful, but on the opposite direction. So for instance, Hawthorne's telling of the Scarlet Letter, and now all of us hate Puritans and think they were all exactly like they were in that book or in the Arthur Miller's book, The Crucible. And so we take as gospel stories that are just meant to be just that, not gospel, but to help us to see something.
Yeah. And that's a great illustration of why we have the little saying that the pen is mightier than the sword. I mean, Hawthorne did establish the reputation of Puritans, even if it's not a faithful and true representation.
It's also a really good warning, Lee, about why as parents it's so important that we be the gatekeepers of what our children read, because what they take in the form of stories will shape them. It will change the way they think and feel about the things in their life. So knowing what they're reading and having good conversations about it. And even a little bit ago, talking about that, we don't often ask the should question when it comes to economics. We do with our literature. In our challenge years, we use that should question a lot with essay writing. But here, even with economics, we can ask should questions. And when we use stories to tell economics stories, the should question is much easier to use. So should the little red hen share her bread with her friends or not? Is a much easier question than should the price go up when the supply goes down?
Yeah. And that's, I think it's maybe in Norms and Ability, if I'm misquoting, someone correct me, but where he talks about the pragmatism of Americans, that we often ask, can we do a thing? Can we get to the moon? Not ought we? And so I think that's a key to the story that we're about to get into. We absolutely can appropriate public funds as charity. And the question this article is asking is, should we do said thing or not? So that's a good way to get into this one.
Good.
So I know that we have our students, as we mentioned, reading this story at about age 14 or 15. And so they're not working a real job yet. They're babysitting or mowing lawns or whatever. And so why is it that you felt so strongly about starting the study of economics with that age group, Lee?
Well, there's two things going on. One is I'm under no illusion that they're going to study economic theory very well at that age. But if we don't start teaching them about the difference between free markets and how people pay for their things, and that there's Bible verses like, if you don't work, you don't eat, that the workman is worth his wages. Ephesians 4:28, I'll read that one, it's a little longer. It says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. So they need to know we're not working so that we can get wealthy. We're working because we're already wealthy, and we want to pass those goods along to our neighbor who's also in need. And the Lord trusts those who are going to work hard. And it doesn't always seem like the reward might be monetary, but there's always a reward, whether it's people respecting you and knowing that you live up to your word. All those are just things that we've been teaching our children since we've told them, stop hitting your brother and go make your bed. These are all economic issues, which is why economics is rooted in the word, or comes from the idea of home economics or home management. Mm-hmm. And it really also lends itself really well to the idea of self-government, that we're studying broader economics outside of ourselves, so that maybe we can actually reflect those ideas back onto ourselves and say, why did I do that? I know I love our friend Heather Shirley would say to her children when they were little, are you esteeming your Legos more than your brother? I mean, our children from the time that they're born are learning to place value on actions and things. Mm-hmm. And we need to have a larger conversation with them as they get old enough to have larger conversations. So that's kind of the practical side. There's another practical side too. Some of the documents we read are really easy. They're stories like we've been talking about, and some of them are difficult. And we need to let our students have this practice in reading higher level, shorter articles before they start reading longer books and debate and history and the various subject areas as they move through the strands of challenge. So there's a lot of reasons that we have these stories starting at challenge 1. And like you pointed out, if you're actually reading the Copper Lodge series and the Echo books, there's a lot of economics in those books too. We're not very good at recognizing it, and we want to help parents intentionally see the economics and help their children see the economics, because it's biblical and its consequences.
Yeah, that's good. And Kathy, I know that you have been doing this a long time, both as a tutor and as a parent. So do you have any testimonials or stories that you want to share about studying economics with these young people?
I used to think economics was big and scary, and I didn't know how to study it, but it's not. So I think when I hit some stories like this and it was when I was an adult with, teenage children, that I realized that we were doing it all along.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's so much of our homeschooling is recognizing that, isn't it? That we've been doing it all along. Well, Lee, I think it's time for us to thank our sponsor, so I'll let you do that.
All right, well, let's thank classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. And we have the entire 2023 Words Out the Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the Classical Conversations book site. Next week, we'll discuss The Money Mystery by Richard Maybury. And if you don't own it, I suggest you do, because it's also one of those kind of what I call, there's these things called chair verses, like verses you sit in and they form your whole life, verses from the Bible. The Money Mystery book and the economics course is kind of a chair seminar with classical conversations that we want you to be able to sit in these ideas and then be able to carry them on to other seminars. And in the Money Mystery and the Penny Candy book, which go together, there's a very popular phrase with the kids. It's called tinstoppel, and it means there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's a great place to begin with young minds.
Yeah. My husband's a wealth advisor, and he says that phrase quite a few times every week. So, all right, well, we can return to our discussion now. We've mentioned a couple times that this story that essay we're talking about by Ellis is taken out of the longer work about the life of Davy Crockett. And so we're about to discuss what are Congress's powers and how should they be limited. And so a lot of us picture Davy Crockett wearing his coonskin cap. Maybe you're singing the television show theme in your head, but besides the coonskin cap, he was later elected to Congress, and that's where we are in this story. So Kathy, do you want to read us our first section so that we can get into our discussion?
Yeah, so he says, we have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity, but as members of Congress, we have no right so to appropriate a dollar of the public money.
I always say that we're against everything the government does until our money is involved or something that we want is being paid for. And what he's trying to say here, that they have no right to appropriate a dollar of the money. He's not saying, in the bigger context of the essay, the story, that Congress doesn't need any money to do anything. The problem is it's this appropriation of money that's for charity, which has never been the government's job.
Yeah. And so I alluded to my conversation that I had with my Challenge 3 students. One of the points of discussion we had that day was that one of my grandmothers had some really, really hard circumstances happen to their family during the Great Depression, and they needed help. But they did not get help from the government. They received food baskets and clothing baskets from their church. And so that was part of our discussion that day in the challenge class, is that there are needs that need to be met, and that it can be done privately. And it has been done successfully privately in the past, but we have forgotten because we now have this long heritage of doing these things publicly.
Yeah, as you say that, Jennifer, it makes me think of one of the other books that we read in Challenge 1, The Best Christmas Pageant Ever, and how in that story there's that local family that are troubled youths and in great financial need, and it's the church that puts together their their annual Christmas baskets and distributes them to some of these local families who are in need. And it's through that they really make a connection with some of these children. It's not sort of the nameless, faceless government check that comes, but it's someone in their community who's bringing them help.
When I was thinking about Amos Fortune Freeman and how he worked so hard to spend money on widows and orphans, because he knew that was his responsibility to take care of them. So we have a lot of books that show that.
Yeah, and one of the last people that he helps, and you can listen to our book club discussion of Amos Fortune if you want to hear the whole thing, but one of the last people he helps is a young man whose mother just can't seem to keep body and soul together for her children. And instead of giving them money, Amos trains him in a job so that he can get on his feet and begin to provide for himself. So there's that idea of helping too.
I think that when people balk against this, I mean, like, they might say, yes, that's right, but then the practicality of living it out is really hard in today's day and age. And so the church is a really good example, and we can talk about, if we want, the failures of the church and how it's been kind of injured and all the responsibilities of the church chipped away as government steps in and Big Brother takes over, and then the church members don't know it's their responsibility anymore. But you don't have to be a Christian to believe in all of these. We used to have these things called mutual aid societies, where people who were of any faith or lack of faith could get together and help one another. And people don't realize that the history of the fraternities and the sororities, right? They're going to think college, which is not where that came from. The history of fraternities and sororities, or sororal groups, is of community members helping one another. So that's where your Elks and your Lions and your Kiwanis and the Knights of Columbus and your Grange and your Masons, all those organizations were established by people who knew they had to come together, whether it was through a like-minded need locally, or even go back to the Middle Age guilds, where people would get together that were tradesmen or taught certain ways in certain subjects. Forever, people have grouped themselves together to help one another in the church and out, but not expecting it to be somebody who they've never met helping them, but they pull together their resources and help one another.
Yeah, I think you're right in a lot of ways there, Lee. And to go back to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, the power of story is part of the problem here. In this particular story, it's a plea from a widow, you know, of a Civil War veteran who is in dire need, and someone forwards a motion and, you know, a bill in Congress to support her, which is a noble and a good idea, but it's impropriety, right? It's not the right thing. It's not the right role for Congress. It's a powerful plea, right? It's full of pathos, but it's not right. And so here, you know, this statement is sort of Crockett pointing at that it's the right thing that people would take care of this poor woman, but it's not the right thing for Congress to do.
Right. And so the solution he proposes is that later is that they give of their own paychecks, so, and not of the public funds. So I think that's good and gets us maybe to our next passage. So that was a good segue, Tim. So Crockett is now put in the position of having to think about the limits on Congress. So because he tells a story in the essay about how he was confronted by a constituent, Horatio Bunce. I love that name. While he's out on the campaign trail, and Horatio Bunce is questioning him about this vote that he had cast in favor of giving this charity to the widow. So and he says that now he can't vote for Crockett because Crockett voted for this funding. So Tim, do you want to read about how he explains why he can no longer vote for Mr. Crockett?
Sure. He says, I did not intend to avail myself of the privilege of the constituent to speak plainly to a candidate for the purpose of insulting or wounding you. I intended by it only to say that your understanding of the Constitution is very different from mine. And I will say to you what, but for my rudeness, I should not have said, that I believe you to be honest. But an understanding of the Constitution different from mine I cannot overlook, because the Constitution, to be worth anything, must be held sacred and rigidly observed in all its provisions. The man who wields power and misinterprets it is the more dangerous, the more honest he is.
Wow. So Kathy, what do you think as we were reading that one out loud?
Yeah, I thought that statement was interesting where he said the man who wields power and misinterprets it is the more dangerous, the more honest he is. And I was wondering, is that because we tend to trust an honest man? We tend to trust that he's made the right decision. And the man himself thinks he's doing good because he is an honest man, but yet he's in the wrong. And I think in this circumstance, they're in the wrong because they didn't ask the should question. The widow was pulling at their heartstrings. They knew something needed to be done, but they didn't ask, should we be the ones to do it? As being in charge of this public money.
I think it's a good time to mention again the Declaration of Educational Independence that we helped to write. It's at educationalindependence.net if you would like to sign it, because that's exactly what we're fighting against. The people who want to have public education, the people who want to have public food stamps, public roads, public libraries, public highways, public everything. It's not because they're bad people. It's because they want to pull people together and provide services and utilities and help them. They just never say, but should we be doing that? And what are the limits of it? But because they think it's a good thing and they have the power to do this good thing, you never step back and ask that question. So we're trying to point that out, that there's definitely spheres where it is dangerous that we have let them be in charge. There's other places where you could argue about the stance that we have. So for instance, you could argue about public roads. Ben Franklin put them into the Constitution via postal roads and postal delivery. And we could say that then, well, it's in the Constitution, it's enumerated, we've all agreed to the Constitution. Let's have an honest talk about private roads and private and public roads and who should fund them. But our Constitution doesn't say anything about helping widows or orphans. It's the church's job. And that's where the misinterpretation causes the problems, because now the church doesn't even think it's their job anymore.
I think this is a great statement for us to take on board as we do talk to people with whom we disagree about policies and the way the government works. Because a lot of our neighbors or family members with whom we have major disagreements about the government, we have this tendency to go to the ad hominem attack, right? To call them dishonest or foolish, or like Jennifer mentioned earlier, stupid. But in a lot of cases, they're not. They just have a very fundamentally different view of what the Constitution is and what our government's for. And talking about those things will actually get at the root of our disagreements rather than just calling them dumb.
Yeah. And also, I think even beyond fundamentally disagreeing, sometimes it's a case of just not thinking creatively about solutions. And so one of the things I love about us working on the 5 common topics with our students is that when you're looking at circumstance, you ask what's possible. Well, is it possible to have private libraries? Is it possible to have private roads? Is it possible to have only private education solutions? And sometimes just thinking outside the box with someone, if you can do it calmly and respectfully, is also a good way, because sometimes it's just a matter of, these are the solutions we've had for as long as we can remember. And so we don't think about what else is possible in the circumstances.
Yeah, there's a story I always read to our boys when they were growing up, and it was called Knock Out That T, because the people who say can't, won't, shan't, all those T's, then they're right. They can't do that because they believe they can't do it. And they don't even explore the possibility of the can or I will. I appreciate that, what you just said.
Yeah. And just one little example, I mean, you and I have been talking a lot lately about this idea of private libraries. And so I decided to put some effort into this idea, because I know a lot of friends don't want to take their kids to public libraries anymore. And I have an unbelievable collection of children's books. So I thought, well, I guess I better act out on my own principles. So I got some plastic book covers and some of those little stamp things that you put in the front of the book. And my daughter is the librarian. And now these families are coming over and getting these children's book stories that are older and reading them. And in fact, it's delightful. I got a text just this morning of someone giving me a testimony about this delightful bedtime story they read to their 5-year-old out of one of my collectible children's books. So that's very sweet.
Great. That's great.
Okay. So our last, I think is it our last one, Tim? Yeah. No, it's next to last. So Crockett has started to see the error of his ways as he's talking to Horatio Bunce. And so Bunce says, look, if you can admit to your errors, then I will actually set up a campaign event to promote you. And in fact, at one point, Crockett is talking about supplying the food, and he says, nope, we have food. I want you to live up to your principles and then come and speak to us. So Bunce lives up to his principles by supplying the food from the community for this event. And so Crockett says, yes, he's going to strictly interpret the Constitution and put these limits on spending. So Lee, do you want to read us our next selection?
Sure. You remember that I proposed to give a week's pay. This is to the widow. There are in that house many very wealthy men who think nothing of spending a week's pay or a dozen of them for a dinner or a wine party when they have something to accomplish by it. Some of those same men made beautiful speeches upon the great debt of gratitude which the country owed the deceased, a debt which could not be paid by money, and the insignificance and worthlessness of money, particularly so insignificant a sum as $10,000, when weighed against the honor of our nation. Yet not one of them responded to my proposition. Money with them is nothing but trash when it's to come out of the people. But it is the one great thing for which most of them are striving, and many of them sacrifice honor, integrity, and justice to obtain it.
I don't think they understand wealth. I don't think they understand that true wealth is not something that you keep and spend on yourself, but it's in giving to others.
And there's a really simple economic principle in here that we always discuss with our kids. You know, when your kids are very small, you'll go out shopping and they'll say, "Mommy, can I have this Lego set?" And then in order to find out if they really wanted it, I would often ask, "Do you mean from my money or your money?" And then they would pause and think. And a lot of times the answer would be, if it's from my money, I really don't want it, which told me that they really didn't want or need it. But it's really easy that they were learning at a very young age. It's really easy to spend someone else's money.
That's a good story.
Yeah, this is a great little bit of the story too, to introduce our students to things that they will need to know more about as they grow into adulthood and they understand what it is to be a fiduciary for someone, to be a trustworthy steward of someone else's goods. I mean, it makes me think of being an elder in a church, right? Where Paul writes to Timothy and says that to Timothy and says an elder in a church needs to be a good manager of his own home, right? He needs to have good home economics before he can be trusted with the economics of the church. He needs to be trustworthy in his own things. And when you are trustworthy, to know both how to keep back what should be kept back and to give, like Kathy was saying, to know when to provide. That's the man who you want to empower, or the woman who you want to give your money to in trust that she'll do well with it and not treat it, like Davy Crockett says here, like trash when it's just somebody else's stuff. I think we see this run rampant today, right? You know, $1 billion there, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon it's real money.
It's true. You know, and back to also, people just don't know how money works and what's going on. And that's another reason to start with these principles when the children are little, and then work their way into the actual, what's a hedge fund and capital expenses and budgets and those things. It's like, I was speaking on this one time at a conference. It was a homeschool conference, and they're generally pretty bright people. And I wasn't even talking about this subject. I just made one of my offhanded comments about probably was ESAs or vouchers, I don't remember. And this young woman comes up to me afterwards and said, "Can you explain that to me?" And so I explained what was going on and how taxes and property taxes worked and those kind of things. And she said, "Wow, I had no idea." And I said, "Well, where did you think the money comes from?" And she said, "I thought someone just prints it." Well, the problem is, she's right. Someone does just print it. And we're letting them get away with that too, because we love our free lunch.
And we'll read a lot more about that, talk more about it next week, right? When we're doing the money mystery.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. So I'm going to read our last, I guess, the moral of the story that Ellis has put on here, which says, "Holders of political office are but reflections of the dominant leadership, good or bad, among the electorate." So what does that mean for us as we vote? And
I don't think he was blaming the average person. I think that he was saying that there's people like Horatio Bunce you should be following. And then, because the average person doesn't, well, like Thoreau said, what? The mass of men lead quiet lives of desperation. And I think he's wrong. I think it's the mass of men are led to quiet lives of desperation. And it's these leaders, this dominant leadership, that is the problem among the electorate. They don't have to hold elected offices. They can be in charge of businesses or NGOs or just your local neighbor,
Mhm.
right? That they are the ones that are going to answer to the Bema seat, I believe, for why did you why did you hide the talents? Why did you steal the talents? Why did you not help the people around you yourself?
Yeah. And at the same time, we can be the Horatio Bunts. If we'll stop and think, we can be the ones that at least ask the questions and hold them to account. Yeah.
What's very hard in today's economy is, I know all of us in this discussion, we're trying very hard to live a biblical life. And it's darn near impossible because of the intrusions from the government that are on us. I mean, I can't walk out of this building without breaking a law, no matter how hard I try.
Yeah. That's hard. And we have a responsibility. I mean, Horatio Bunce is able to hold Crockett to account because he knows his Constitution. So,
Yes.
which we're trying to help our students know those documents too, so that they can hold people to account and hold themselves to account.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We got to hold ourselves first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you guys today. Do you have any closing words, Lee? Because I think we're out of time.
No, I just really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and I'm glad Kathy's joined us. We'll miss Stephanie, and hopefully she'll be back soon. But thank you, Kathy, for your contribution, and thanks to all of you for listening.
See you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.